I can tell you that I had a few conversations, when I was in there, with whoever he or she is, and just saying, if you could just get me out of here, I will be a better person.
It was a voice that seemed untouchable, smooth as silk, effortless as the ocean breeze. In 1980, Christopher Cross didn't just enter the music scene, he conquered it, pulling off a clean sweep at the Grammys that stunned critics and peers alike. But fame can be a fickle tide, and for Cross, the waves that once carried him to dizzying heights would later drag him into a quiet, almost invisible exile. What could transform the golden boy of yacht rock into a man the public barely recognized? Before the awards, before the platinum records, there was a boy from San Antonio with a quiet demeanor and an unassuming dream. Christopher Charles Geppert was born on May 3, 1951, into a military family, where discipline was as common as morning coffee. His father, a U.S. Army doctor, moved the family often, uprooting Christopher from place to place before roots could take hold. For many children, this meant a childhood of broken friendships and constant readjustment. For Christopher, it meant something else, a deep and private bond with music. The guitar became his anchor. In his teens, while other boys chased glory on the football field, Christopher spent long hours in his room, coaxing melodies from 6 steel strings. His voice was already a quiet marvel, clear, pure, almost unnervingly smooth. But it was the guitar that gave him confidence. It was there, hunched over chords and notebook paper, that he began shaping songs that felt like private conversations set to melody. By the late 1970s, Cross was playing in small Austin clubs, his voice a rare gem in a sea of louder, brasher acts. He didn't have the look of a rock star. No leather jackets, no wild hair, no sneer, just a gentle smile and a disarming sincerity that made audiences lean forward rather than back. In an industry obsessed with image, this was both his greatest weakness and his greatest strength. Then came the break. Warner Brothers Records took a chance on the soft-spoken Texan, gambling that his songs could find a home on the radio. No one, not even Christopher, could have predicted just how quickly that bet would pay off. His debut album, self-titled Christopher Cross, was released in 1979. It wasn't just good, it was immaculate. Songs like Sailing and Ride Like the Wind didn't just climb the charts, they owned them, weaving themselves into the soundtrack of a generation. Cross's music wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. There was a serenity to it, a polished warmth that made listeners feel they were being gently carried away. It was yacht rock at its most pristine, and the world was ready to be swept along. But in those early days, as the applause swelled and the awards began to beckon, there was already an unspoken truth forming beneath the surface. The very qualities that set Christopher Cross apart were the same ones the industry might one day turn against. The transition from an unknown Austin musician to a global sensation happened with such speed, it was almost disorienting. Within months of his debut, Cross went from playing smoky clubs to headlining packed arenas. His boyish humility, initially a curiosity, was now being packaged and sold as part of his brand. The industry painted him as the reluctant superstar, the soft-spoken genius whose music spoke louder than his presence ever could. It worked. By 1980, Christopher Cross was a household name. Radio stations played his songs on heavy rotation. Ride Like the Wind had an urgency that made it feel like a road trip anthem. Sailing was so gentle, it felt like a lullaby for the soul. This versatility, his ability to drift seamlessly between high energy and contemplative balladry, was rare. Then came the night that would cement his place in history. The 1981 Grammy Awards. Cross didn't just win, he dominated. Album of the Year, Record of the Year, Song of the Year, Best New Artist. In one evening, He achieved what no other artist had done before, or has done since, winning the Big Four Grammy categories in a single year. The victory was historic, but it was also dangerous. The spotlight, now at its brightest, began to magnify every detail. Cross was celebrated for his flawless voice and impeccable songwriting, but critics began to whisper that his music was too safe, too polished, too easy to consume. His humility, once refreshing, was recast as a lack of charisma. It was the kind of backlash that often follows meteoric success, a subtle shift from adoration to skepticism. And while Christopher tried to ignore the noise, there was a growing sense that the clock had already started ticking on his reign. The 1980s were changing, and so was the music scene. The MTV era was coming, and Christopher Cross, with his gentle smile and understated stage presence, was about to find himself at odds with a new kind of fame. The morning after the Grammys, Christopher Cross woke up to a new reality. He was no longer the quiet Texan singer-songwriter with a promising album. He was the man who beat the odds. The press devoured the story. A man with no flashy wardrobe, no rock and roll scandals, no carefully constructed persona, just a clear voice and a guitar, had conquered the most competitive night in music. But behind the polite interviews and the grateful smiles, Christopher felt the shift. The world now expected him to keep winning. The magic of his first album had set an impossible standard, and his label wasted no time in pushing for a follow-up. There were tour dates, photo shoots, endless promotion schedules, duties that pulled him further away from the solitude and creativity that had birthed his debut. In private, Cross was exhausted. The constant travel wore him down, and the industry's fixation on image made him uneasy. He wasn't a performer in the theatrical sense. His magic was in the intimacy of his music. But intimacy is hard to maintain when you're projected on massive screens before tens of thousands of people. Then came the unspoken challenge. MTV. The channel launched in August 1981, changing the music world overnight. It wasn't enough to sound good anymore. You had to look good on camera. Music videos became as important as the songs themselves. For Christopher Cross, whose appeal was rooted in voice and musicianship rather than visual spectacle, this was a turning tide. The very medium that had propelled him to the top, radio, was being overshadowed by a visual revolution. And as new, image-driven stars began to dominate, the man who had once been untouchable found himself fading from the conversation. Christopher Cross had made history, but history was already moving on. The question was no longer whether he could win again. It was whether he could survive in a world that was beginning to forget how he got there in the first place. In the months following his unprecedented Grammy sweep, Christopher Cross found himself living in a paradox. On paper, he was on top of the world: platinum sales, sold-out tours, and an international audience that still hummed Sailing in supermarket aisles. Yet beneath the shimmering surface, the machinery of fame was beginning to wear him down in ways the public could never see. Success, especially in the music industry, doesn't simply arrive. It demands payment. The currency is often personal freedom, privacy, and creative control. Cross had signed a deal with Warner Brothers with the belief that the music would always come first, but the label now saw him as a rare commercial goldmine. They wanted more records, faster, and they wanted them packaged for a market that was rapidly evolving. Everywhere he went, there were bright lights and microphones, endless interviews where the same questions were recycled. What does it feel like to be a Grammy legend? How do you follow perfection? At first, he answered politely, the same steady voice he used in song. But the repetition began to feel hollow. There was no space to talk about the long hours of writing in solitude, the subtle doubts creeping in, or the pressure to somehow outdo an album that had already been labeled a masterpiece. The touring schedule was relentless. Hotels became interchangeable. The faces of the audience blurred together. Fans still adored him, but even the adoration became part of the grind. A smile here, a handshake there, until genuine connection was lost in the rush. His soft-spoken nature, once a novelty, was now painted by the press as detachment. Articles began hinting that Christopher Cross was aloof, that he lacked the showmanship to keep pace with the rising crop of music video darlings. MTV was only a few months old when the whispers grew louder. In its neon-soaked broadcasts, artists like Duran Duran, Michael Jackson, and Madonna exploded onto screens with carefully crafted images that made them not just singers, but living, breathing brands. Christopher's videos, by comparison, were simple, sometimes just him and a guitar, or staged performances that barely hinted at spectacle. The truth was, Cross didn't want to reinvent himself into something he wasn't. But the industry was changing fast, and purity of craft was no longer enough. The spotlight that had once illuminated him was now beginning to burn. He worked on his sophomore album, Another Page, with quiet determination, pouring himself into songs like Arthur's Theme, Best That You Can Do, which earned him an Oscar. Yet even with that triumph, the numbers told a different story. The album sold well, but not like the first. The narrative was already shifting. Christopher Cross was yesterday's news, a relic of pre-MTV radio, a voice out of sync with the new visual age. For the first time in his career, the applause at the end of a show began to sound faintly like goodbye. By 1983, the tide had fully turned. The slick, image-driven pop acts of the decade dominated not just MTV, but the entire culture. For Christopher Cross, whose music had been built on intimacy and timeless melody, it was as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted overnight. Record executives began speaking a language he didn't recognize. They wanted visual hooks, marketable aesthetics, and music that pops on video. Cross listened politely, but these were not the terms that had guided him when he first strummed his guitar as a boy in Texas. His songs were crafted like letters, personal, deliberate, meant to be felt rather than watched. As his career entered the mid-'80s, he noticed his singles climbing the charts more slowly, sometimes disappearing after just a few weeks. Radio stations were tightening their playlists, giving priority to artists with a cross-platform presence, those who could command both sound and image. A generation of listeners was growing up not on vinyl covers and liner notes, but on the rapid-fire visuals of music television. In this new world, Christopher Cross became something of an anomaly. He was respected, even admired, but no longer essential to the cultural moment. His label still believed in his talent, but their investment shifted toward artists who could drive MTV airtime. The budgets for his videos were modest, the promotional pushes less aggressive. This was not a fall from grace, so much as a slow fading, a gradual erosion of visibility. Cross still toured, still recorded, but each project seemed to reach fewer ears. The audiences that once sang every word now showed signs of distraction, as if their hearts had moved on to newer sounds. Behind the scenes, Christopher was struggling with more than just the shifting music landscape. Fame had never sat comfortably on his shoulders, but now it felt like a suit that no longer fit at all. He began to retreat, not in a dramatic, headline-making way, but in small, quiet steps. Fewer interviews, shorter promotional tours, longer stretches of time spent at home in Texas. And yet, even in this period of decline, the man who had given the world sailing refused to chase trends. There were no desperate attempts to reinvent himself as a synth-pop icon or to swap his sound for something grittier. He held fast to the music that had always defined him, even if it meant slowly drifting out of sight. The irony was painful. The very refusal to compromise that had once made him a beacon of authenticity was now the reason he was fading from the spotlight. The tide of the 80s had turned decisively, and Christopher Cross, steadfast at the helm of his own ship, was being carried away from the shore. By the late 80s, Christopher Cross's place in popular music had become bittersweet. He was still a respected figure, capable of selling out certain venues and releasing albums that garnered loyal praise from longtime fans. But the days of chart domination were gone. His voice remained as flawless as ever, crystalline, emotive, untouched by the years. But in the eyes of the industry, it belonged to another era. This was a cruel paradox. His gift had not diminished. It had simply become unfashionable. In the pop world, styles change quickly. But for Cross, whose art was built on timelessness, that change felt like exile. His music didn't sound old, it sounded eternal. And yet, eternal was not what MTV wanted. When he released Every Turn of the World in 1985, the reception was lukewarm. Critics called it pleasant, but safe. A familiar echo rather than a bold statement. The truth was that Christopher had no desire to be bold for boldness's sake. He was uninterested in chasing what was hot, if it meant abandoning the subtlety and sincerity that defined him. The business side of music, however, was less forgiving. Without major radio play or MTV rotation, his sales declined further. Warner Brothers continued to support him, but there was an unspoken understanding. Christopher Cross was now a legacy artist, not a contemporary star. The promotional budgets shrank, the tours became smaller, and his presence in mainstream pop culture all but disappeared. Personally, this was both a relief and a wound. Away from the spotlight, Cross could live more freely, without the constant demands of fame. But with that freedom came a nagging sense of loss, not just for his own career trajectory, but for a time when music itself seemed less disposable. He began focusing more on live performances, where his voice could still command awe in ways television could not capture. At these shows, often in mid-sized theaters rather than arenas, fans who had followed him since the early 80s would close their eyes and hear exactly what they had heard decades earlier: perfection. Yet outside those concert halls, his name rarely made headlines. He had become, in a way, invisible, his work quietly continuing while the larger music world spun on without him. Christopher Cross was still sailing, but now on waters far from the storms and spotlights of mainstream fame. And though he may not have realized it at the time, this distance from the glare of the industry would later prove to be both a shield and a source of tragedy when the next great chapter of his life unfolded. From the outside, Christopher Cross's retreat from the spotlight looked like a peaceful choice, a graceful bow from a man who had already given the world his greatest work. But behind closed doors, the reality was more complicated. Fame had been both a gift and a weight, and stepping away from it did not instantly bring peace. Cross had always been a private person, and in many ways, that privacy was his defense. But as the calls from record executives slowed and the invitations to industry events stopped arriving, there were long, quiet stretches where he was forced to reckon with a question he had avoided for years: who am I without the music industry's approval? The early 1990s brought more changes. He continued to release albums, each filled with the same craftsmanship and lyrical sincerity that had defined his career. But they were now niche releases, cherished by a loyal fan base, but largely ignored by mainstream critics and radio. The marketing machine that had once carried him to every corner of the globe had turned its gears toward younger, more marketable acts. This decline in visibility didn't mean Christopher was idle. He wrote constantly, often in solitude, without the deadlines and commercial pressures of his early career. Yet without that external demand, there were days when inspiration felt like a lonely echo rather than a calling. Music had once been a dialogue between him and millions of listeners. Now it was a conversation he held mostly with himself. Personal struggles began to seep into his work. Songs carried heavier emotions, subtle shades of melancholy, and reflections on impermanence. His lyrics hinted at disappointments and unseen battles, though he rarely spoke openly about them. Friends say he was never bitter about losing fame, but he was quietly wounded by how quickly an entire industry could move on. Financially, he was stable. His earlier success had ensured that. But in an era where success is often measured by visibility, Christopher felt the sting of being forgotten. He could walk through a crowd unnoticed now, a fact that was both liberating and unsettling. There were also health concerns. Though he kept them private at first, years of touring and performing had taken their toll on his body. His once effortless voice required more careful maintenance, and he began to be selective about when and where he performed. In the quiet of his Texas home, Christopher spent more time with his guitar, returning to the comfort of the same chord progressions he had played as a teenager. He was still creating, still capable of moments of pure beauty, but it was clear, at least to him, that the chapter of global fame was closed. What he couldn't have known then was that life was preparing him for a far greater test, one that would not be fought in studios or on stage, but in the far more personal battleground of his own body. The news came quietly at first, shared only among close friends and family. In April 2020, as the world was gripped by the fear and uncertainty of the COVID-19 pandemic, Christopher Cross fell ill. At first, it seemed like it might be a mild case, but within days, his condition worsened. The man whose voice had once soared over oceans was now struggling simply to breathe. When he was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder that causes the body's immune system to attack the nerves, it was a devastating blow. The illness left him partially paralyzed, unable to walk without assistance. For someone whose career had always been tied to physical presence, touring, performing, this sudden loss of mobility was more than just a medical challenge. It was an existential one. Fans heard about his condition only when he chose to speak publicly, months later. In interviews, he described the illness with the same calm humility that had marked his career. But behind that composure was a deep well of struggle. Recovery was slow, often agonizing. He had to relearn basic functions, endure grueling physical therapy, and live with the uncertainty of whether his voice and his life would ever fully return to what they had been. The timing of his illness, amid a global shutdown, made the isolation even more profound. There were no tours to return to, no crowds waiting to sing along. The music industry itself was in turmoil, and Christopher found himself alone with his thoughts for longer than ever before. In these moments of isolation, he reflected on his life's arc. He thought about the nights on stage when the applause felt endless. He thought about the sudden vanishing from MTV screens, and he thought about how, in the end, none of that mattered as much as the simple ability to sit with a guitar and play. The illness forced him to slow down completely. At times, it felt like the final curtain had fallen, not just on his career, but on the man he had once been. Yet there were also moments of profound gratitude. Small victories like walking across a room without assistance, or singing a line without his voice faltering. When he did eventually return to performing, it was not with the triumphant roar of a comeback, but with a quiet resilience. His body bore the marks of illness, his movements slower, his frame thinner. But the voice, that miraculous, unmistakable voice, remained. And yet, for many who had lost track of him over the decades, seeing him again at 74 was a shock. The Christopher Cross they remembered was frozen in time, forever young and untouchable. The man before them now carried the weight of years and battles most would never see. When Christopher Cross began performing again after his illness, audiences were unprepared for the change. The man who stepped onto the stage was not the radiant, boyish figure of 1981, but a survivor. His hair was thinner, his movements measured, his frame leaner from months of illness. There was a vulnerability to him now, a visible fragility that made every note feel hard-won. But there was also something else, something deeper. Stripped of the trappings of fame and the polish of image, Cross's performances carried an honesty that transcended nostalgia. Each song felt like a confession, each lyric a fragment of a life lived fully, with both triumph and loss etched into its melody. For fans who had been with him since the beginning, the experience was bittersweet. They saw in him the living embodiment of time's passage, a reminder that even the most untouchable voices and faces are subject to change. Some whispered about how different he looked. Others found themselves moved to tears by the sheer courage it took to stand on stage after such an ordeal. Interviews during this time revealed a man at peace with much of his past, though still wrestling with the reality of aging in public. He spoke candidly about the industry's fickleness, about the speed with which fame evaporates, and about how, in the end, the only constant had been the music itself. Social media reactions to his reappearance were telling. Some were shocked, even disoriented, to see him so changed. Others celebrated him as a living legend, grateful for the chance to hear him sing again. But in both cases, the conversations often centered on his appearance rather than his endurance, a testament to the cruel ways in which public memory freezes its icons in their youth. For Christopher Cross, the stage was no longer about maintaining an image or chasing chart positions. It was about connection, about standing before a room of people and sharing something true. The applause now felt different, less like a roar of idolization and more like a collective acknowledgement of survival. And though he would never again reclaim the cultural dominance of his early career, there was a quiet dignity in his return. He had faced the currents of fame, the isolation of obscurity, and the storm of illness, and he was still here, still sailing, even if the waters were calmer now. In the end, Christopher Cross's story is not one of a single sharp fall from grace. It is something quieter, something more human, a gradual fading from the bright stage lights into the softer, more forgiving glow of personal truth. Fame had once been an ocean for him to sail upon, but over the decades, the waves receded, leaving him with a shoreline he had never expected to stand upon. At 74, the man who once defined the sound of early 80s yacht rock no longer moves through the world with the anonymity of a total stranger, but neither does he command the instant recognition of his peak years. Those who stop him now are often people who carry his music in their memories like a photograph from a lost summer. Listeners who can still feel the warm breeze of sailing in their bones. For them, his legacy is untouched. The charts, the awards, the headlines, they are all secondary to the feeling his songs gave them. And perhaps that is the truest measure of a musician's worth. Not how long they can remain in the spotlight, but how deeply their work roots itself in the hearts of those who hear it. Yet Cross's legacy remains complicated. He is remembered as much for the improbability of his rise, the historic Grammy sweep, as for the music itself. In the shorthand of pop culture, his name is often invoked as a symbol of how fleeting mainstream glory can be. But this shorthand misses the truth. Christopher Cross was never chasing a persona. He was never selling rebellion or reinvention. He was selling honesty, wrapped in melody. The industry that once adored him moved on, as it always does, toward the next marketable sensation. But time has a way of circling back to what is genuine. In recent years, a younger generation of listeners, children of the fans who bought his records in 1980, has begun discovering his music anew, streaming Ride Like the Wind and sailing alongside the latest hits. Still, the man himself is far from the image those songs conjure. His body bears the traces of illness and age. His voice, though still remarkable, carries the faint shadow of battles fought off-stage. For some, this contrast is jarring. For others, it is a testament to survival. Proof that the same artist who once soared so effortlessly can still find his way through storms. When he walks onto a stage now, it is not as the fresh-faced Grammy Golden Boy, but as a man who has lived through the strange alchemy of fame, loss, obscurity, and illness. And when he sings, there is a depth to it that can only come from someone who knows exactly how precious each note is. Christopher Cross may never again dominate the charts or redefine the cultural moment, but perhaps his true legacy is not in being everywhere all at once. It is in being exactly where he is, still standing, still singing, and still reminding those who listen that beauty is not always loud nor eternal, but it can be unforgettable. Christopher Cross's journey is proof that fame can be both a crown and a chain, and that sometimes the quiet endurance after the spotlight fades tells the most profound story of all. His music remains, untouched by the years, waiting for those willing to listen beyond the image. What do you remember most about Christopher Cross?